Do the disclaimer and lead it in.
All right. Well, welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for another Esports Healthcare health chat, weekly health chat. Today, we're going to be going over the claw grip for
The
controller
claw.
for controller users. And but before we get to that, let me introduce. We got Dr. Dan. Give us a little wave. Dr. Corey, Dr. Jordan, and I'm Quinn, Cameron Quinn. And before we get started, let's jump on with a disclaimer from Dr. Corey.
All right. So, the information we discuss today is for educational purposes only and is not intended to replace the advice of your doctor. Esports Healthcare disclaims any liability for the decisions you make based on this information. Any interaction during this stream does not establish, nor does it imply, a doctor-patient relationship. Esports Healthcare does not offer this information for diagnostic or treatment purposes.
Cool.
So, now that we're getting into it, today, as Cam just mentioned, we're discussing the claw grip for console gamers. So PC gamers, unfortunately, this stream is not for you, but you're welcome to watch. So I'm going to turn it over to Cam
Learn a little
first.
something.
And Cam, you're the gamer. So the first question: did you or do you claw when you game now?
Okay, so I do claw, but it's more of like a lazy man's claw. I only claw for these two buttons, the Y and the B on an Xbox One controller.
Yeah.
A more like aggressive claw would be over to the X and A buttons.
Mm-hmm.
But I usually just stick to like the lazy man to switch the weapons, and then to B, I guess it used to be for Halo 1 was and Halo 2 was just for melee, and then Y is to switch weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And the purpose of the claw is since this bottom joystick is your aimer, like what you're shooting at. The claw is to kind of keep you from taking your thumb off that. Otherwise, you'd have to press the Y button and come off the aim. So you're still able to focus on your aim and press these button with the claw grip. So Y and B. I'm like afraid to press these. I think they're gonna do something on my computer, but they're not. So, but
Yeah, so-
This is
also,
a video.
I mean, nowadays, clicking this joystick is melee, and then this is a thruster in Halo 5. Um, an old pro Gandhi used to use the clicker as a melee, and then B to zoom in. So I think he may have clawed
Wow.
to zoom in with the
So,
B button.
yeah, that was the-
green thumb. Yeah, is what they
Yeah,
called it.
that was a Call of Duty configuration for a while too. I think like Modern Warfare 2 was one of the settings. I think.
Yeah.
That's weird.
You know,
In Halo, that's really weird.
That sounds
Yeah.
weird, yeah.
And like it's really, I mean, it's more of like an efficiency thing. So you can still aim while press these buttons and still have control. I mean, and then
Nice.
you get the aggressive clicks. But I personally don't really know the full mechanics behind it. So Dr. Jordan, are you willing to? Do you want to kind of give us a little background?
Yeah,
on
I
the
can.
claw?
I mean, as someone who doesn't really play on console anymore, this is a little foreign to me. And we were talking about it off stream before. Even just sitting in this position, I'm using a PlayStation controller. This is exhausting for my hand. I hate every second of this. It doesn't feel good on my index finger, and so there are a couple muscles that are, involved in this, I guess, motion grip style. And the first is going to be your dorsal interosseous muscles, and so they're in between the bones of your hand. That's what interosseous means. And so they're responsible for helping in flexion of the finger, extension of the fingers as well. We're going to kind of primarily focus on the index finger because that's really what's doing your clawing here. And it's going to help to just bring it around on all of these buttons, right? And even like just said before, this my finger's already tired. I'm not made for this kind of grip. I can't do it. It's just I don't even know how people play with like that way. It's just so foreign to me. Um, but in sitting like that, and I'm joking that my finger's exhausted, but this is a lot of strain on your finger. And I know that Cam had said he kind of uses a less aggressive claw and only using, so this would be triangle and circle.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually more aggressive than it is to let your finger relax and use like square and X, because your finger can kind of rest versus you have to actively flex that finger to stay up top. And so I mean, I
It
don't know if
might
you guys
be.
can I don't know if you guys can really see this tendon poking out of my finger, my hand here. But when I relax and just go to square, it almost disappears. And as soon as I go to move for triangle, or even circle, like that actually almost hurts my hand to get in there. I just don't have the mobility to get there. Um, so yeah, I'll stick to my keyboard. That's way easier for me in using a mouse.
Yeah.
But and then you have your flexor digitorum, your flexor and extensor digitorum. That's going to help. Like I said, the extensor is going to help bring the finger back to be able to aggressively hit those other side buttons, whereas the flexor is going to be responsible for using your trigger fingers, right? So flexing and creating that claw, or even just gripping a controller regularly, right? Because it still applies to people who hold the controller like normal people. um, right? This is flexion. By pushing the trigger down, that is flexion. So you're going to be using the flexor compartment of your forearm. Actually, it's through here, and that's going to be helping to control your fingers, right? Because if you make a fist, all these tendons pop out, right? So it's important to remember that the majority of the main movers of your hand actually originate in the front and back of your forearm. That's really all I kind of have to say about the, I guess, the smaller, I guess both smaller and bigger muscles of the hand. One other thing to talk about is the dorsal interosseous actually helps bring the finger away, but also to push into the buttons as well, right? So it's going to be helping do both. There are muscles on both sides of each bone, right? Because we're not just going to rely on gravity to push the button down, because that's just never going to happen.
It's not fast enough.
Yeah, it's not fast enough. I don't really have much more to talk about there, other than I hate it because it hurts my hand.
So one thing, I know I read this and I posted it on the link because it was so interesting. That first dorsal interosseous that you mentioned, its primary function is to separate your index finger from the others, so like that, which on the claw grip is how you get into the position to do that. So from the side, that's that motion there. The other thing that I read about, and I found a research study for it, was that it flexes the first knuckle, so it pushes the first knuckle down, and keeps the second and third knuckles extended. So if you look at the use on a claw grip, that's the entire thing. So you, like, reaching down this way is flexing, reaching back up is extending, and the whole time you're keeping your finger out, otherwise you're rubbing the buttons. So you're essentially using that muscle for the entire duration that you're using claw, which that's unique to anything I've ever noticed in gaming, where one muscle is so heavily active for so many different motions at the same time. I only learned that a couple weeks ago when I was researching for the post that we made. So I thought that was super interesting.
No, it is, and even like I said, I was joking. Like even right now, I can feel the tendon in my hand around my first finger.
It's exhausting.
Like, it's tired. Like I truthfully don't know how people. I mean, I'm sure it's a practice thing, but it's uncomfortable to hold
it's definitely something. It's definitely something you kind of you train yourself to do over time, because you eventually get to the point where you can kind of naturally press these buttons with this finger. I mean, I know that I can go ahead and press YB, and it's almost like I'm pointing down on them like this to an extent. But I mean, the X and the A, it's a lot harder. I have smaller hands too, so it's a lot harder for me to kind of get to it.
Small hands.
Small hands.
And for you guys at home who maybe aren't really console players like Jordan, who's more familiar with the computer and the keyboard mouse setup, if you want to kind of feel what muscle's going on, you can actually get it to pop out and kind of see what we're talking about. So like Corey was saying, where it's that flexion and extension of the rest of the finger, and kind of just bring that index finger a little bit over towards the tip of the thumb, and you'll feel right here, you'll feel a bulge. I guess it's a bad word for that. You'll feel a bump or a kind of a, you'll feel underneath you, you'll feel the muscle starting to contract, get larger as it's, pulling the two bones towards each other, interosseous between the two, and you'll feel it pop out, and you'll notice as you hold it for a couple seconds, like Jordan was saying, holding it for even a little bit, you feel it starting to fatigue, and you'll feel it pop up. And
for those of you who are keyboard players like myself, if you are at the WASD position, hitting shift with your pinky, you're actually utilizing some of the interosseous muscles to bring your pinky away and push, right? Because you're not pushing down, right, you almost push outward when you hit the shift key, right? Because you're hitting kind of the edge of it. There's like, I mean, I don't know about your keyboard, mine has like a lip on the shift key, so I almost use that every time I hit it, and it kind of just, I slide off the shift key as I hit it. So you're A B ducting your pinky away from your hand. So that's how you're gonna feel it similarly, just not
Even
the same.
for the PC user, even if you're on WASD, if you need to reach to R or F, you're using the first dorsal interosseous the same way that console user would. So I don't know how frequently that happens. I don't do PC gaming that much, but if
So
Oh,
F is usually like an interact where G is a grenade. So yeah, you can.
yeah,
definitely
so
gonna have
that's
to reach.
that's your extension on your, it'd be left hand in that sense. For console users, it's always the right hand because we claw. You're not clawing the joystick because that's nuts. But for the left hand on the PC user, that's that extended using your index finger to reach over from the D button out to maybe the G button, and that's the same mechanism. Just it's a lot more intense on the console user because this is a ridiculous situation that we have.
So is there a downside to using the claw? Let's bring this over to Dan.
Unfortunately, there are some downsides, risks to using the claw grip, and while it does have its gameplay advantages, kind of from a physiological or health standpoint, the things you're really looking at from a risk point of view is, as you guys might have noticed from trying it, is fatigue, chronic fatigue if you continue to do it. Pain is associated with that too, and if it continues to develop, you can develop strain type injuries. Strain, not sprain with a T. Meaning it's more muscular as opposed to ligamentous. And again, these are due to the mechanics of the grip. We kept talking about how it's so unnatural feeling for someone who hasn't done it before, who's not built up the endurance or anything like that to it. And it's really, although Jordan listed a few different muscles that are involved overall, it's really that first dorsal interossei, that's going to be the prime focus of a lot of that pain, chronic fatigue, strain type issues. And again, not only is it an Xbox issue to some moderate level, it's an even greater risk for those type of issues for PlayStation 4 users. Jordan, if you could lift up the controller for a second, and Corey, if you could look up your controller, the PlayStation and the Xbox, please. You'll notice that the Xbox controller is a little bit wider, less confined. You'll see the joystick is in a different location on the PlayStation 4, and that's going to put a little bit more strain to be able to reach those buttons as you go, to square and circle as opposed to X and B. The controls are a little bit more, accommodating for the claw in an Xbox versus PlayStation. Although neither is really great, it is a little bit harder to do with PlayStation controllers. So those are really the risks and downsides you're looking at from a health perspective, not gaming perspective.
But they are avoidable.
Yeah.
That's good news.
That is really good news. That's
Nice.
great to know.
That's funny.
Like, for instance, so looking at fatigue. So really what's happening is you're holding that muscle in activation in a constant isometric contraction. So isometrics are, if you can think back to doing planks, you'll feel that kind of in the ab region, or back to basketball practice and whatever things you had at gym, doing those wall sits where your back's against the wall, legs in a 90 degree at the knee, and the hip. They hurt, they burn, does not feel good. Holding that muscle in activation, muscles are supposed to contract and relax. This is really just focusing on that long isometric contraction as throughout your entire gaming session. And you're going to notice burning with that is probably the physiological response to it, and that's due to lactic acid buildup. And that usually comes with long static or repetitive contractions if you continue to do it. And, if you talk to people who constantly do claw, they're not going to notice as much of it as someone who, like the four of us, were just playing around with it.
It's exhausting for us.
More beginners do it. Yeah, it was incredibly exhausting. But as you continue to do it, you're going to build up endurance. You're going to get better at clearing out that lactic acid. The threshold for pain and burning from the lactic acid is going to go up. So it'll take longer periods to do it. But it's something that, really that fatigue is going to be burning, and with endurance and buildup, it can go away in time. And then, so you'll notice that we did it for a few seconds and it was burning. But if you continue to do it, you'll notice that with the further activation of the muscle, there's going to be increased fatigue. It's going to continue to increase, more burning sensation, and also coming with that, a slight risk increase for injury, something we all don't want. And then another point, there was a study done actually specifically on the first dorsal interossei, very relevant to what we're looking at today.
Perfect.
And it was perfect. I believe Corey found that, so thank you for that. And so what they did was they performed an exercise involving that muscle owing to fatigue, and then they measured a baseline contractile velocity, how quickly you can contract that muscle, at baseline, immediately after, and they found that after fatigue, the velocity, how quickly you can use the finger to hit the buttons, to move across the controller, is going to decrease. So now, not only is it painful, but it's also going to make you not as proficient with the controller, not as proficient at gaming, something also we don't want. But the good news with that was they took a third measurement, which was 10 minutes later after the fatigue exercise, and they found that the velocity returned back to baseline. Nice. So what do we learn from that? Is breaks are good. Not just, a couple a break here or there during game, which is very good, very nice, but also taking longer breaks every now and then. We're not going to tell you to not play. We would never suggest or say anything like that, but you have a lot of hours in the day. And if you could fit in, even a 10 or even 15-minute break every now and then, you might notice that you'll have less fatigue and pain in the hand, and you'll play better. You'll hit the buttons faster.
That's how they get you. You play better.
That's how they get you. Yeah.
So sticking with the fatigue and pain, Dr. Corey, is fatigue or pain, is that considered an injury? Fatigue.
Yeah. So not exactly. The injury, the pain and the fatigue. Fatigue specifically is not an injury. Fatigue is in reference to essentially just feeling tired and being exhausted. And then, as Dan mentioned, fatigue in a muscle can include the lactate threshold. So the lactate threshold in physiology is when you contract a muscle, one of the byproducts of the energy pathway is lactic acid. So a lot of times you hear people talk about that when they do weight training. And a lactic acid buildup from the byproduct of the activation of the muscle accumulates over time, and as you rest, then it clears out. But if, as Dan mentioned again, if you're not resting that frequently, that lactic acid can build up to a point where there's so much of it existing in the blood that's controlling the muscle that there's not enough of the rest of the molecules that you need to contract because it's crowded by the lactic acid, and then you physically can't contract the muscle. So athletes will usually identify that feeling as hitting the wall. So you've probably heard that. A lot of runners usually describe that. I think swimmers will describe it a lot. Hitting the wall is that sensation of, even though you're trying to contract the muscle, you physically can't. And that's from the lactate buildup. So the 10-minute break gives you that clearance, and the fatigue, therefore, would then be gone. The pain by itself is not an injury, but the pain could be indicative of an injury that's either occurring or maybe occurring soon. So ultimately, your pain tolerance, or not, pain tolerance is not the word. The pain fibers, the nerve fibers that elicit pain, are essentially there to tell you that something's going wrong. So is it an injury itself? No, but maybe it's leading to it. So the problem with the claw grip that Dan was starting to talk about it's one thing is fatigue. The other thing is the contraction type. So when you have the controller, if you look at it this way, the isometric portion that Dan mentioned, the static, is bringing your finger from the button or the front trigger on the PlayStation controller and lifting it out to the front of your controller. So obviously, if I didn't lift my finger outward, I couldn't get it over the face. It would just be stuck on top. So the isometric is holding it out to be able to clear the face of the controller. And then the other part of it, Jordan mentioned the contracting back and forth is also activating the same muscle. So we have isometric outward, and then we call the shortening of a muscle concentric. So we have isometric out and then concentric back and forth constantly. The other side of the contraction that doesn't exist in gaming in any sense is called eccentric. It's when you take a muscle and that's active and it's being lengthened under tension. So the easiest depiction of that is if you picture a biceps curl. So if I stand there and I curl this way and I pull the weight in, the muscle's getting shorter. That's your concentric. It's kind of the standard that we use for muscle contraction. Second part is if I'm still holding that same weight and it's pulling my arm open and I'm resisting it slowly, that is the same muscle. The bicep is still active, but it's getting longer, so we call that eccentric. And the eccentric is important because that's what protects the muscle, and more importantly, it protects the tendons from having injury. So back to your original question, is the pain the injury? Maybe not, but the isometric combined with concentric only contraction, repetitive, can lead to an injury that we describe as a repetitive strain. I prefer calling it overuse imbalance because, as I just mentioned, you're using isometric and concentric, but you're not doing the eccentric. So I know it seems like a little bit of a mouthful, and it's kind of a lot of physiologic jargon, but to understand it, basically, it's you're shortening the muscle over and over again, and you're never allowing it to open up and stretch under tension. So it's essentially creating a shortening of the tendon until it's injured. So that's the real issue. Another one is that you're using the same muscle over and over again. So like you're doing that motion, but you're not actively doing the motion where you bring them back in. So like if I squeeze my finger here, that would be agonist, the primary mover, versus the antagonist, the opposite movement. So it's not super common in the claw grip that you're going to be pulling your finger aggressively back inward. So those two create an imbalance that could lead to that overuse strain, that repetitive strain injury. So that's what the risk is for that injury.
And if you remember back to our earlier videos, we've discussed some of these overuse imbalances, overuse injuries. So whether it's mouse elbow, mouse shoulder, medial epicondylosis, there's seems to be a track record for these things involved with gaming, unfortunately.
Yeah, and the big reason for that is, I think I mentioned it during that long discussion, is that in gaming, we do everything with concentric. So we're always shortening our muscles. If you're a PC user, you're clicking downward and your fingers are getting contracted this way, but we don't put any resistance on those same muscles to open up. And it's that concentric versus eccentric imbalance, the lack of the eccentric portion, that leads to so many repetitive strain injuries to the tendons. And like Dan mentioned, there's a common one in your shoulder for PC users using the mouse. There's a common one in your elbow for PC and console users, depending on which, it's one side or the other. Then we have a risk for the claw grip to develop that tendinosis through the side of the hand. There's another one for console gamers, we call it gamer's thumb. Using these joysticks can lead to the same thing. So,
or texting.
Yeah, there you go. Texter's thumb, gamer's thumb, it's all the same. Yeah.
Angry thumb.
Yeah, it's rough out there in this tech world.
So it's called imbalance because you're doing too much of this motion and not enough of the opposite motion. Correct?
Yeah, the imbalance is twofold. So it's too much of flexion for the console user and not enough extension, but it's also too much of the contraction forced inward without something pushing their hand back open. So the example would be, I have these finger bands. So if I put the finger band on and I open it, that's concentric extension. And then if I slowly close my hand, that's eccentric extension. So I'm still using the same muscles on the way back in, but I'm decelerating the force of it closing. The bad version of this would be if I opened it and then just allowed it to close. That is concentric opening and lack of eccentric on the way in. Does that make sense?
So exactly. So you want to have the balance. You want to have the balance. You want to have the opening and then the slow close.
Yep. Yeah, so
Exactly.
in gaming, there's no example of that, unfortunately, because for example, if I push down this trigger, there's a little bit of resistance when I close it, but when I'm done pressing the trigger, I just let it go. So
Yes.
there's no eccentric.
So yeah, it's what's interesting is that you think of like imbalance. So what I explained before is like them closing, and I would think the opposite would be like opening up. You know what I'm saying? Like going like
Hmm.
that, but really it's just getting the pressure.
It's yeah. You would if it's closing is the action, then you would need something to forcibly open your hand, and you try to resist it from opening.
That's pretty cool.
So it
The
would
only
be
time you would probably see it in gaming is mainly with people using the mouse and keyboard, and even then, the extension portion of that motion is going to be very little. You know, if you, I don't know, specifically, it wouldn't be more so for FPS games, but anything like Dota, Leagues, World of Warcraft, more your RPG style games where you need to use extra buttons. So if you're using the number row and even your function keys, your F through 12, reaching from the number keys even to F2, F3, you have to extend, but it's not that motion, right? It's not full extension. You're almost reaching and inducing a little bit different of a flexion, but you still have an extension component, right? So that doesn't mean you're going to get away scot-free. You definitely need to be working on the extension muscles, but there is a component of extension with using keyboard.